I think that there are some challenges that the CFTA, no matter how incontestable the rationale aspects or some of the rationale that Mr. Bayfield put forward are, and we will all agree on those. At the same time, we have to say that there has been, alongside these concerns and their common acceptance, there have been some concerns about both how some of the processes have been undertaken so far and have evolved, but also some of the substance as well. Okay, so I see my job here in terms of trying to bring us all into the discussion in a more direct and participatory way, to kind of raise some of the concerns that different stakeholders have had, both with the process so far and with some key aspects of the content itself. I think no one disputes some of the things that Mr. Bayfield said. For example, he said African economies are small, for which reason structurally we disable ourselves from benefiting from economies of scale of production. He used the word production importantly, which I thought was very important. But I think there are many ways to look at what we mean by small economies. One such way is to say that we are small because the economic activities where our economic actors and producers are predominant are fragmented. So a farmer producing 1.5% acres or half a hectare, it is his or her disconnection with industry, with the banking and credit system, with the way in which retail chains are being developed, with the trade infrastructure, with distribution and so on and so forth. It is that disconnect, that fragmentation, that actually means the smallness of our economy. In other words, if we look at smallness that way, rather than only, let's say, population and so on, although all those are relevant, we will recognize that transforming our economies in terms of their small size requires interlinking our sectors first and foremost. It is in the process of such interlinkage, in the process of such integration, that actually the economies of scale become possible. The fact that one sector produces raw materials for another, the other produces finished or intermediate goods for each other, the credit system, the trade credit that arises because producers are linked and consumers and suppliers are linked. It is that trade credit which also becomes part and parcel of a domestic banking system and so on and so forth. That same domestic banking system which interlinks us gives us a sense of what priorities to promote according to the level and stage of our development, of our integration. Which is to say, we want a situation where public policy and public resources can be prioritized according to making an intervention to direct finance to given sectors to transform them. Now, that doesn't necessarily sit automatically with a sweeping liberalization of services up to 90%. So I'm saying that in as much as we all agree with what Mr. Bayfield is saying, there are some real sector needs and real sector realities which I think ought to engage with that. So that is why when he stresses the role, for example, of the private sector, I think it's a very important consideration. Because when we cast our minds to how that private sector is actually structured in Africa, from the MSMEs, because most SMEs in Africa are not actually SMEs, they're really micro household enterprises, all the way to big commercial firms as they exist or can survive. And every day in our news, our headlines are filled with aspects of the kind of challenges and realities which the CFTA ought to be able to be concerned about addressing. Yesterday, Dr. Bamia, or the other day, 2 days ago at this ECOWAS monetary conference, he says, we have fiscal imbalance of payments deficits. That is what is holding back our arrival at a common currency. Fiscal imbalance of payments deficit, directly related to the structure of our trade and our inbuilt trade deficit because of the structure of our economy. When we talk in terms of involving the private sector or other stakeholders in the CFTA, it is vital because it is their needs that must precede, not simply be anticipated, must precede the considerations and priorities and the way in which the CFTA unfolds. In the kind of process that Mr. Bayfield generously described for us, he, for example, identified the fact that even as a process, two things were paramount in the consideration. One is that the CFTA process will be member state driven. Then he also says that in addition to this being a member state driven process, there will also be a way in which that mechanism is reflected in the negotiating forum. But if you have a situation where, because of the timeline that we looked at, negotiations were launched June 2015. We were supposed to have some preparatory steps up to February 2016. All the studies of 55 economies, and there are 1 million sectors or non-sectors, with all their missing markets, their missing finance, their missing tech, all of that in 6 or 7, 8 months. it became impossible for the negotiation, one, for the member states to be genuinely in the driving seat as far as them representing a broad-based national consensus, which starts from where we are at. It became also impossible for the negotiating forum to function as such. So it is the technical working groups, which by default took over the process. Now that has serious implications, because the technical working group simply say, we'll start from some of the principles, trade negotiations that Mr. Bayfi laid to us. What is the acquis? The acquis is the state of concessions and that, let's say, ECOWAS have. If ECOWAS have liberalized their trade 80% with the European Union, this is the state from which we proceed. We do not ask that question, that if you look at the state of private sector today, may it not be wise to actually use this opportunity to reverse some of the damage that the EPA's type of liberalization might have caused us? Because that too ought to have been a possibility. But if it is simply about a technical working group which has to finish delivering on its mandate in the shortest possible time, excluding member states by and large, excluding even more than the member states themselves, the private sector, other stakeholders, civil society, and so on and so forth, then the technical working group goes into autopilot. What we have done before, we do more of. But that mightn't actually be the case in point. And when we look at that not being the case in point, the world tells us it is not the case in point. Why? Because the trade regime globally is in crisis. Trade itself, as an economic activity, is going backwards. There is a trade recession which is protracted for Africans. It's expressed primarily as a result of the collapse of commodity prices since 2012, 2013, accelerated in 2014. This year there seems to be a marginal recovery and so on and so forth. The legitimacy of the CFTA derives, as Mr. Bayfi himself said, from Africa's regional integration agenda in two respects. One is AU 2063, which anyway was fleshed out after the CFTA was launched. So in a sense, it's not really a master document that we can look at. But more critically, we can look at the Abuja Treaty. The Abuja Treaty, from which the CFTA lays claim to say that it is actually the manifestation of that trade integration dimension of the Abuja Treaty. But you see, the Abuja Treaty has a completely different rationale, even though it uses the same words, transformation, so on and so forth. It certainly has a different approach. The Abuja Treaty does not start from trade liberalization. Mr. Bayfi made the excellent point that our markets are too small and so on and so forth. But the fact is that if you create a market, you integrate and create a bigger market from simply a trade market, it does not guarantee you the ability to either to supply that market or, as he himself said, whether somebody else won't take over that market for you. That is why in the Abuja Treaty, the sequencing of trade liberalization was subject and secondary to transformation of production, reintegration and reorganization of production linkages, and so on and so forth, and a whole series of different steps over a very long window. What I'm trying to suggest is that this is a moment for us, and we have to be very thankful to Mr. Mixon, Mr. Bayfi, and the others from the Ministry of Trade for being here today. Because in a sense, they're actually fulfilling the mandate of a consultative, participatory transformation agenda. This is a moment in a period when the known certainties of the world trade regime, both in terms of policy framework, in terms of trade agreements, in terms of the performance of trade itself, all of those things are in crisis. It is an opportunity for us to actually see how we begin to recast this orientation, even on the small scale of our one district, one factory. It is on that basis that we can also become more participatory. But I doubt very much that an agreement like this actually has been central to the work of Parliament. Because Parliament deals with all the agreements that we deal with. It ought to be possible for them by now to see what the provisions, the modalities, the actual text and the annexes mean in terms of all these things. It ought to be possible for Labour to see what it will cost it or how it will help it rebuild itself. It ought to be able for us to see what kind of intellectual work by the likes of Professor Santi and his outfit, by the university students and university departments may be here. What is the new thinking around which we can generate around this? I think that these are some of the things that we ought to aim for, and hopefully by the end of the day, we'll have some concrete steps how we actually bring some of these things together in an active, involving process. Thank you very much.